Good evening. My name is Learotha Williams Jr., and I am Associate Professor of African American and Public History at Tennessee State University. I also have the honor of serving as the founding coordinator of the North Nashville Heritage Project, where I and my students explore the history of African Americans in the Music City. I am a scholar who was formerly trained in the history of the U.S. Civil War and Reconstruction and African American Studies at Florida State University, where I earned my doctoral degree in history in 2003. I'm also a veteran of the Gulf War, and according to my best estimate, my ancestors were brought here to America in chains during the early 1790s. Um, I want to speak to you for a few minutes about the bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, share a few thoughts and my visceral reactions to it as a scholar of history. And I want to offer a few reasons why it should be immediately removed from the state capitol to a museum. Um, Although the volunteer state began integrating its public spaces in 1964, the placement of this bust of Forrest in a position of prominence in the Capitol did not occur until 1978. And when that occurred, for me, at least when I heard that history, um, for me, it was tantamount to placing a gold plated whites only sign on state property. From its elevated position, this golden totem encompassed a carefully crafted false narrative of the lost cause and enshrine the spirit of white supremacy in the capital for the next 40 years. Um, I first started looking at forests seriously in grad school when my professor, Joe M. Richardson, offered me a graduate level reading course on Reconstruction. And I thought it was going to be an easy class because, hey, I like Reconstruction, right? And I love to read. Um, but honestly, it was one of the most difficult summers of my life. Dr. Richardson dispatched me to the library to read 13 volumes of a series that was known as the Testimony Taken by the Joint Select Committee to inquire into the affairs of the late insurrectionary states, or more commonly known as the KKK report. It is without doubt some of the most difficult reading that I have ever accomplished. Um, to say that Forrest is deserving of a space in the Tennessee state capitol, one must overlook the significant events in his life and ignore the voices of the people he victimized. A description of his Memphis slave pen reminds us that women were often stripped naked and with a bucket of salt water standing by in which to dip the instrument of torture, a heavy leather thong, their backs were cut up until the blisters covered the whole surface, the blood of their wounds mixing with the briny mixture to add torment to the infliction. Another account of the horrors of the forced slave market was given by Lewis Hughes, a formerly enslaved black man who escaped to freedom shortly before the Civil War. Hughes describes his wife's family sale, recalling that none of them were sold to the same person except my wife and one sister. All the rest were sold to different persons. Their daughter was even sold 7 times in one day. Having a bust in the place of honor on Capitol Hill requires us as citizens to ignore the historical record and to treat the memories of the people he bought and sold as irrelevant. It requires us to refuse to acknowledge the weeping of the mothers who were in that space, women who wept inconsolably at the thought of being separated from their children. It requires us to ignore the horror that a woman might feel knowing that her sale was imminent. and realizing at the same time that she's pregnant and that she would soon be bringing a child into the world. It requires us to discount the fear that a young child might face as she enters the yard, unsure about what's about to transpire and wondering if they would ever see their family or their loved ones again. Keeping the bus in the Capitol is a signal to the world that we embrace, that we celebrate, that we honor the daily horrors that occurred in that space. As a historian of the Civil War, I've encountered people that laud for skills as a leader. Um, but I humbly submit to you that when you read the accounts of Fort Pillow, um, you have to reach the conclusion that he was a flawed, if not a failed, leader of men. Elias Falls of the United States Colored Troops gives us some insight into that seminal event in Civil War history. Falls remembered that on that particular day that they killed all the men after they surrendered until orders were given to stop. They killed all they came to, white and black, after they had surrendered. Another account informs us that it says, then followed a scene of cruelty and murder without parallel in civilized warfare, which needed but the tomahawk and scalping knife to exceed the worst atrocities ever committed. The rebels commenced an indiscriminate slaughter, sparing neither age nor sex, white or black, soldier or civilian. The officers and men seemed to vie with each other in the devilish work. Men, women, even children, wherever found, were deliberately shot down, beaten, and hacked with sabers. Some of the children, not more than 10 years old, were forced to stand up and face their murderers while being shot. The sick and the wounded were butchered without mercy. The rebels even entering the hospital building and dragging them out to be shot or killing them as they lay there unable to offer the least resistance. Right? These stories are well known um, to those that think highly of Forrest and those that don't think much of him at all. But it's interesting that as a historian, I've encountered many efforts by some to excuse what happened at Fort Pillow. Some by people whom I respected up to that moment. Um, I remember being at a conference and a really sweet elderly woman informed me that the black soldiers were drunk on that day. And she suggested that had they not been drinking, they would have survived. And then when you hear that, you say, had they not been under the influence, then maybe they would have survived. And we still hear this sort of things today, I humbly submit to you. Another humorous excuse suggests that if they had only complied with Forrest's order to surrender, they would have survived. Um, but we know that once it became evident that black soldiers were going to fight for the Union, Jefferson Davis issued an order that said that no quarter would be given to any black soldier. And last, and I heard one of our state representatives say this recently. He said that the accounts from Fort Pillow are, and I quote, fake news. Even by the standards of his day, Nathan Bedford Forrest was a leader who ordered his men to engage in war crimes. And I feel as though one of the great ironies of his bust sitting where it sits, um, it's only a stone's throw away from our historic War Memorial Auditorium, a place where we honor our veterans. Last, to justify the placement of a bus here in the Capitol, you must forget that Forrest led a terrorist organization during the post Civil War period. one that victimized both black and white Tennesseans. And the accounts um, are there for you to engage. As I said before, there are 13 volumes of this, and with us being residents of Tennessee, we can always find something that hits close to home. For example, I there's one account that reads as follows. This gentleman explains to the committee that the Klan could not find me at my house, so they came up the road, hallooed 3 cheers for Brownlow's head and Sam Arnell's. They shot at me 7 or 8 times and run me off from home. Question: did you leave your crop in the field, and do you feel it unsafe to return? Would you feel that your life was in danger? Answer: yes, sir. They have told me that if I ever come back, they would kill me. The spite is because I beat a drum for colored children and have been a soldier in the Union Army and belong to the Union League. They say that they intend to kill every Negro that belongs to any of these things. That is all I know. And that was Wesley Alexander. And lastly, in order to honor Forrest Buss in that space, you must also mute accounts of those given by a recently freed enslaved man named John Lawson, who remembered after being driven away from his home in Columbia, Tennessee. He says, the next morning, I started for Nashville, and within 1/4 of a mile from where I started, I found a man hanging up by the feet. He had been skinned. I think in discounting these stories of that period, these indictments of Nathan Bedford Forrest, um, you must, and this is most troubling for me, you must ignore or you must discount the fact that our dependents are still among us today. They are still with us today. In closing, Nathan Bedford Forrest was a man who profited off the sale of human beings. He waged war against his country and led a reign of terror against members of his home state. Forrest represents the worst of us as Tennesseans and as Americans. His actions and those of the people he inspired contributes directly to the mentality that enables law enforcement to execute a no-knock warrant and murder Breonna Taylor and remain at large at this very hour. His legacy as a slave merchant resonates with us as we watch the murder of George Floyd, as we hear his ancestral cries, and we look on in shock and disbelief as the police watch in what I thought was amusement and contempt. His life as a terrorist reverberates in our lives as we remember and speak the name of Jacob Blake, a man who was shot in the back by the police 7 times in front of his children. Forrest Buss should not be in the Capitol. It should not be in a space of honor. It should be moved. And wherever we move it, it should sit as a cautionary tale of our need to keep our dark sides of our human nature in check. Thank you for listening.
Dr. Williams, thank you so much for coming. I cannot tell you what it means to us to have you here. We were ending on your presentation a bit earlier than we had planned. So if there's anyone in the group chat that has a quick question, we can have time for just one. We're more than willing to ask it. If not, we can definitely move on. and continue. Checking the Facebook messages right now to see if there's one. Doesn't look like it. Thank you very much for coming again, and definitely really appreciate it. Oh, a question about Forrest and Vic, please. Yeah, Tristan, what's up?
I was just gonna ask. It was something that, as I've been like Googling Nathan Bedford Forrest over the last few weeks, which I wish I didn't have to do with my time. I didn't realize how much there's these periods of time where he had rented out the entire jail population of Shelby County to work on his plantation. And one of the things that I hear a lot from defenders of Nathan Bedford Forrest, I grew up in northern Alabama where the horrors committed by him were not the first things I was taught about. When I hear people defend him, I often hear people like rely as a last resort on this idea that he had reformed later in life based on this speech that he gave that was, less than sincere when he was running for office, I guess. And one of the things I wanted to ask is, for people who make that argument of him having reformed later in life, after having founded the Klan, if you have any thoughts about him actually having been the primary user of the convict lease in Memphis or in parts of Mississippi during that same time.
Two quick responses. Convict leasing was another form of slavery, right? So it wasn't a big leap from selling folks to renting folks to work on your plantation. But about him reforming, and I can understand that, but I would make the argument that he's close to the back end of his life and he might be thinking about what lies ahead of him. So, oftentimes, even George Wallace reformed once he came close to his end. But the thing is, Tristan, I've yet to see a statue of Forrest as a reformer. Every time you see a photograph or a bust of him or anything, what he's in uniform, they are celebrating him as a warrior. That's not the thing that folks think of when they think of Forrest. They think of a guy who fought against the Union. They think about a guy who led the resistance against Reconstruction or the quote Africanization of the South. Basically, he was a guy that fought to keep blacks in their place. But there's also a concerted effort to excuse his actions, right? Because if we embrace that, then what does that say about us as Tennesseans? And rightfully, if we want to talk about people that fought for liberty, that fought for freedom, we have generations of folks that could be discussed. So when I first became a historian, I used to argue about this all the time. And after the first 4 or 5 years, I was like, okay, I've had enough. And truth be told, I wouldn't have given Forrest much discussion at all until I saw the bus in the Capitol, or that ungodly thing that's off of I-65 that is now sporting a coat of hot pink paint, which I think is pretty cool.